I think you have a candidate that is in Harris, a candidate who is obviously running in the shadow of Biden. She is doing that, I think, for political reasons, of course, feeling that she can't thoroughly reject Biden's policies, nor would she want to.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. In this episode, we'll peel back the veneer of Vice President Kamala Harris's foreign policy position with historian and author who specializes in US foreign policy, American politics, and the history of the Cold War at Yale University, Dr. Michael Brenes. Is Harris a visionary forging a new path, or, as former President Trump recently said in his debate with her, merely echoing Biden's footsteps? Join us as we dissect what a Harris administration could mean for America and the world, offering sharp insights into the potential shifts in US leadership on the international stage should Harris win the 2024 US presidential election, right here on The Focus. Michael, welcome to The Focus.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Michael, considering Vice President Kamala Harris's track record with world leaders and global summits, how do you assess her readiness to potentially craft a distinct foreign policy doctrine compared to that of President Biden? What indicators suggest she might diverge from or follow Biden's approaches?
I think it's unclear at the moment. I think you have a candidate that is in Harris, a candidate who is obviously running in the shadow of Biden. She is doing that, I think, for political reasons, of course, feeling that she can't thoroughly reject Biden's policies, nor would she want to, given that she feels, I think, she needs Biden's coalition and Biden's supporters who were with him in 2020 and continue to be with him. He represents an element of the Democratic Party that she is trying to appeal to throughout this campaign that is mostly kind of like a working class union vote, union voter. She's trying to reach out to more people in the rural parts of the country. I think she very much feels that she can't repudiate Biden for fear that she's going to lose some of these voters. I think that's a political answer. I think the other substantive response to this is that she was responsible or involved in many of the policies that were crafted by and created came out of the Biden administration. And I think she feels that she has to defend those. Uh, and when pressed on what she would do differently, as she was yesterday in an interview, she basically says there's really nothing I would do differently. The only thing she would do different than Biden is she said she would appoint a Republican to her administration, which I don't know why that that would be the case, or what good that would do, considering the political moment we're in. But that's what she said. So I think it's unclear. I think you'd have to point to, as I have in my writing and in my other commentary, you'd have to point to some of her advisors that are around her and people who might be willing to carve out a different path than Biden, people who came out of the Obama presidency, um, and came out of thinking about US foreign policy in ways that I think are quite different, generationally different than Biden, given who Biden is and where he made his career and when he made his career. But I think you'd also have to point to those people and say, perhaps, given um, some things they've written, and here I'm talking about Phil Gordon, uh, Harris's now security advisor, and Rebecca Listner, her other advisor, main advisor on foreign policy, and look at those writings that they've authored and say, perhaps there's a different path forward, given, I think, some of their Listner's and Gordon's skepticism about um, the role of American power creating democracy in the world and the idea of a democracy versus autocracy. So that's a broad opening statement to say I think there's a lot that's yet to be determined at the moment.
I just want to pick you up on something, Michael. I mean, so if you're a betting man, and I suspect in your game you might have to be slightly, so who would be the Republican you think that Kamala Harris would bring into the tent? I mean, we're not looking at the likes of a Dick Cheney, for instance, for Secretary of Defense.
Well, I think it's funny. I mean, you mentioned Dick Cheney, but she's been courting Liz Cheney,
Yeah, yeah.
who, and
Hey, Cheney.
A.
Yeah.
Cheney. I mean, the person doesn't have to be Secretary of State. They could be Department of Education. Secretary of Education. They could be something else on Homeland Security. I don't think she. I think that would be politically unwise and potentially untenable for that person she was nominating if they're Secretary of State or now Security Advisor or um, something to that effect, high-ranking cabinet position. So I don't know. Maybe Liz Cheney, a moderate, someone who's a never Trumper, but
Yep.
Liz Cheney seems to be the person she's courting
Hmm.
because of her potential crossover appeal. I don't know. I don't think that's necessarily the wisest political move, in my opinion, but someone's obviously telling her that this is a good idea and she should be moving this direction. I think that person should be fired, but that's that's my 2 cents.
No, look, I understand that, but I suppose you have to look at it from the perspective that we've been in the politics of division for so long. You could sort of almost
Sure,
understand the outreach to whoever on the other side who wasn't the worst of the lot. A never
sure.
Trumper would probably do the job. But anyway,
Mhm.
let's leave it there. Kamala Harris has been described as a human rights hawk and a pragmatic internationalist, which labels more accurately capture her foreign policy stance based on her actions and statements as vice president.
I think she's definitely more pragmatic internationalist than anything. I don't. I think she would be obviously concerned as many people are around her, and she herself has been concerned with human rights. I don't know if that would then translate to be her being a hawk on human rights. And I confess I don't really know what that would entail in policy terms. But if you look at her statements, you read her statements, you read what people have written, the, the advisors around her and what they've written. It's very much a foreign policy that I think is committed to American power, committed to American primacy, but using American power in ways that are selective and I think would be different from Biden in the sense that I don't think Harris would frame I the context or the purpose of American foreign policy as one to sort of save democracy from autocracy. I do think that she rightfully so believes that autocratic nations are threats to the United States, that autocratic regimes are on the march, and that autocracy is thriving in many parts of the world. I don't necessarily think that would translate to a foreign policy that would frame American power in those terms. And the question is sort of where would that be applied to? I don't know. On China, I think she's very much or would be very much beholden to policies of Biden, her predecessor, if she would be to be elected. I think she'd also be beholden to the policies on Ukraine. And I don't see how, given the things that she said in the debate, how that would be different. But I certainly think perhaps on the Middle East, and this is where there's some possibility for that pragmatic internationalism. On the Middle East, I think, given again the things that Gordon has written, Phil Gordon has written, that Rebecca Lissner have written, more Gordon in this case, that she'd be reluctant to endorse a full-throated, um, or she'd be reluctant to endorse, let's put it this way, reluctant to endorse uh, a wider war in the Middle East to the likes that we're potentially seeing now in Lebanon. And I don't think she would she would support a war in Iran. That's not, to me, pragmatic to the interests of the United States and to the wider interests of the world. But again, this is yet to be determined.
I was going to leave that for a little bit later, but now that you've brought that up, Michael, the idea of a wider war that started off in Gaza as a relatively contained Israeli series of military strikes has now included southern Lebanon and Hezbollah, has literally
Hmm.
decapitated the Hezbollah leadership. And of course,
Hmm.
we've had this long range shooting match between Israel and Iran, ostensibly to try to for Israel to try to get rid of the so-called Hydra monster that is Iran, controlling its axis of resistance allies all over the place. I think personally there's been a lot of exaggeration with regard to this, and the reason why I say that is because Israel has almost near perfect intelligence when it comes to its adversaries. And I think that the decapitation strike against the Hezbollah leadership showed very clearly that it wasn't the existential threat that was portrayed in the media by Netanyahu, his right-wing supporters, and obviously those people supporting that sort of agenda. This puts America in a very tricky position because, of course, America has very close ties with Israel. It also is beholden in many ways to the very powerful Jewish lobby group, AIPAC. It has deep, deep ties back into American politics because American politics is based on lobbying groups, and the most powerful lobbying group gets to walk into the Oval Office whenever they like. And I think that AIPAC basically ticks that box quite nicely. Considering all of this interlaced, interwoven problem with the Middle East, how difficult would it be for a US president to sit back and take a pragmatic and, dare I say, even more nuanced approach to how Netanyahu is prosecuting this war? Because you said just a moment ago, it wouldn't be in America's interest to see Israel go completely off the rails with Iran. But will
Hmm.
Netanyahu actually listen? Because obviously he must be thinking that America is kind of on a political no man's land right now, giving him enough room to maneuver, get his job done, and then sort out the Americans sometime down the track, maybe June, July of next year, when things have settled down domestically.
These are all excellent points. Uh, I would simply respond by saying two things up front. One, the incursion into Lebanon, the airstrikes and the Israeli troops that are now going into Lebanon have been reported, as reported in Politico, been endorsed by the Biden administration. So those maneuvers, those decisions, seems to be, from all our press accounts, have been accepted and endorsed by the Biden administration because the Biden administration believes that there's an opportunity to, if not reshape the Middle East, at least, as you say, take out Hezbollah as a threat to Israel and to its interests, and potentially make, as the Biden administration would see it, Israel more secure and more capable of defending itself against potential threats down the road. Um, that I think, though, as you're implying and as I've implied, that is going to lead to potential engagement from Iran. Iran, we have reports, are figuring out what to do at this point. We will see what they do in terms of response. I mean, they've already responded with, close to 200 rockets being fired into Israel. Um, no casualties came from that. The strike was obviously well coordinated and careful not to achieve any of minor casualties. Um, but we will see if they respond with something more aggressive, more confrontational. If that were to happen, I think things would escalate to a point that if Harris were elected, and she's now in office in January of 2025, she'd be faced with a critical decision, I think, perhaps the most critical decision of her presidency in foreign policy, which is, are you going to let Netanyahu carry out this wider war for reasons that he professes to want to do so to keep Israel safe, um, to neutralize Hezbollah, or as many people have said, and I continue to believe, Netanyahu wants this war because he has his own political future at stake, because he knows that once this war is over, he is most likely going to be out of office.
Mm.
And there are many Israelis who want the hostages home, who want the war to end, who are calling for a ceasefire. They were doing so on October 7th of this year, on the 1 year anniversary of the October 7th attacks.
Yep.
And I think that has to be said outright. I think what Harris would be smart to do is to say, this is Netanyahu's war. This is not the Israeli people's war. He has crossed a red line by if he tries to engage Iran in a way that would lead to a war between Israel and Iran. I think that would, in my view, hopefully be enough for Harris to say, this is a red line. We're not going to do this. Pull back your troops. And then you'd have to condition aid, condition arms, things that the United States at this point has been reluctant to do, things that we did do during George W. Bush's administration and the Reagan administration. And I think that's really critical at this point, is to, we're dealing with a very delicate situation. And my concern is that in the rush to reshape the Middle East, we're not carefully thinking through all the consequences that, and I say we, the United States and the Biden administration. And I think Harris would be subject to dealing with this in ways that I would hope would lead to different outcomes, given what we've already been presented with by the Biden administration.
No, I mean, I hope so too. I mean, the central question I think most of our audience would like to know, though, is in your opinion, as a historian, do you think from what you've seen of Harris as vice president, do you think that she has the strength necessary to go toe to toe with the likes of the wily Benjamin Netanyahu?
I think the United States is holding, look, yes, that's a good question. Let me back up and say, I think the United States is holding a lot of the cards. They're not holding all the cards, right? Um, there's a debate, I think, a very good debate about how much can the United States do to stop Netanyahu. Things have, I think, become clear in the past few days when Macron came out and said we were not going to support a greater war in Lebanon, that they will cut off aid to Israel. I think that set a precedent. And you saw the response from Netanyahu. It says, well, you are then basically, he basically said Macron's siding with the Hamas and Hezbollah terrorists. That's what he basically said, or he's allowing terrorism to thrive by not supporting Israel. I would think you would see a similar response by Netanyahu, where he would want to carry out this war and do so in bluster and through without again clear ends and understanding the ramifications of his actions. If the United States would do something, but I do think that then there's a time limit to that. You're going to run out. He's eventually going to run out of steam. He's going to run out of political capital, and he's going to run out of American support. He's going to be isolated within the international community. Israel, I would say, is already isolated in many ways because of its actions in Gaza. It'd be further isolated, and that's not good for the Israeli leadership, and it's not good for the Israeli state. Whether Kamala Harris is willing to do that, I think, again, I think you can strategically position yourself and say, this is a war that's waged by Netanyahu. It's not Israel's war. We support Israel. We do not support the Netanyahu regime, and being very careful about that. The Biden administration has failed at this point to make that distinction. I think Harris would be wise to make that distinction, and then that would provide her, I think, with greater leverage in terms of how she could position herself in the United States, given all the pressures and interests that you said are shaping American politics and its support for Israel.
Michael, just listening to you makes me wonder how this war is affecting America, or dare I say, the Biden administration, and its capacity to support Ukraine. George W. Bush, I think, did make mention at some point that he could walk and chew gum at the same time. Do you think that American, or the people who are in charge of American foreign policy, can walk and chew gum at the same time? There was a time not that long ago in history, but certainly a little while back, where America was quite confident in being able to fight a war on two fronts. Now it can barely support one front. Um, how does this all work out for another president moving forward? I mean, Harris steps into her role potentially with the idea of being a lot weaker as a geopolitical entity than it once was from a military perspective, which means that the perception of American power isn't what it used to be in the international community. How does Harris potentially navigate this situation? Because yes, America is still the most powerful country in the world, but it has certain limits, and it is trying to figure out a way in which it could fight or at least support one war on one side and contain another war on the other side of the world. That requires power of a sword.
You are alluding to, John, you're alluding to my main critique of American foreign policy at the moment, which is that the Biden administration has said that we're going to be an arsenal democracy to Ukraine.
Yeah.
We're going to provide everything that Ukraine needs. Um, but we're going to do so also while we engage in a long-term competition with China over economic and military supremacy, not just in the South China Sea and the broader Indo-Pacific, but potentially globally. And then we're also going to be providing Israel with unconditional aid to wage a war in Gaza and now to wage a war in Lebanon and Gaza and potentially against Iran. The United States was an arsenal democracy during World War II. It was waging a war on two fronts during World War II because the United States committed to a total war, committed to industrial capacity, and it committed to military buildup that led to 46% of its GDP being allocated to military expenditures. That created many jobs and um, boosted the economy out of the Great Depression. But I don't think the United States wants to go back to an era where half of our GDP is reliant upon military spending, where we are engaged in, and we can't go back to either that era, because we just, and also we're engaged in a war that, at that point would entail potentially a defense of Taiwan, amphibious invasion of Taiwan, that being a case where we're in a total war kind of scenario. Um, Perhaps I'm being too nightmarish in my scenarios, but
Mhm.
I do think that there is a sense that the Biden administration has not carefully thought through the priorities of the United States and what ultimately it can and cannot do. The Biden administration did not have to have this be the case. I think we did not have to be in this situation. The Biden administration, Joe Biden, and many of the people around him, Jake Sullivan, um, Kurt Campbell, and Tony Blinken, were primarily focused on a competition with China, and China being the preeminent adversary of the United States or rival of the United States. Maybe they wouldn't use the word adversary. Ukraine happened. Um, continue to support the allocation of arms to Ukraine, but that war is now 2 years long, over 2 years, 2 years into it, and we do not have an end game to that war at this point. The Russians are, after looking like that they were going to be, if not defeated, at least rolled back. Uh, they are on the offensive again, and it doesn't look good for the Ukrainians. And now we're in a position where Israel is on the march in the Middle East with no end in sight. This did not have to be the case, and I think this is the preeminent mission, of I think of a President Harris, in my opinion, is in addition to making decisions on smarter decisions on the Middle East from day one, is clearly allocating in a strategic sense what exactly is the United States' purpose in the world, what can and cannot do, going back to a language of limits, circa Jimmy Carter, and even Obama, even though Obama and Carter didn't adhere to those limits, but trying to rein in American primacy in ways that I think are to the benefit of the United States, its people, and I would argue also the large world. We will see if that happens, though. because as you said, we cannot be everything to all peoples at once. And I would say that Ukraine is a priority. I would say even China is a priority. I think the way we're going about our competition with China is terrible. But I do think, there's room for a lot of improvement, particularly as it relates to the language that we use to focus on competition with China. Um, but I think ultimately the Middle East is a huge distraction from those problems. And I would also, the preeminent problem for me is the strength and vitality of American democracy, and what we as Americans, are are dealing with in terms of the internal threats to democracy, whether that be the rhetoric that we see coming from people like the likes of Donald Trump, whether that be through polarization, whether that be through lack of resources, social resources to Americans, whether that be the threats to reproductive rights in this country. Those things I think are also or could be seen as national security threats, and we need to prioritize those. Um, and we're not doing that, I think, at the moment.
Speaking about democracy and speaking about China specifically, there's been a lot of lip service given by US administrations currently and in the past with regard to where certain administrations stand on persecuted groups within the People's Republic of China. And we're talking about people like the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and Hong
Mhm.
Kongers. Um, where would Harris stand on all of these persecuted people's human rights, considering that she seems to be more that way inclined in order to sort of facilitate human rights? Or is she kind of tied to Biden's ham-fisted approach to China, where it's kind of like on again, off again? Now it seems to be on again, at least with trade. And every time you trade with a country like China, you're facilitating the leadership to continue doing what it always does, which is repressing the internal dynamics of its people, basically, because the
Hmm.
party is a repressive machinery. So how does America become true to itself, true to democracy, when it really has to trade with China on the one side,
Sure.
and it also has to try to maintain a sense of its own ethics and morality on the other?
I think that's a good question. I don't have an easy answer for you. If I did, maybe I should be, head of, maybe I should be Secretary of State or something.
Maybe you should.
But, I think to me, you're again hitting on something which concerns me, which is the instrumentalization of human rights as a you know tool of, but not the focus of American foreign policy. If we truly were to focus on human rights as the basis of our foreign policy, going back to Carter, which is what Carter tried to do, then you would see that rhetoric, that language applied to every country. We don't
Yeah,
see that language applied to every country. We see it selectively applied to, um, which is to China. And again, this is not to discount the clear human rights abuses that are going on in China towards the Uyghur population, towards Tibetans, Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and what's happening basically in those concentration camps in Xinjiang. It's horrible.
yeah,
But I would also say if you wanted to truly apply human rights language and a human rights foreign policy, then you would have to also take into account the human rights of Palestinians. You'd also have to take into account the human rights of the Sudanese. You'd also have to take into account, the human rights of many populations in Latin America and El Salvador and places like that are fleeing to the United States looking for asylum, and we're just simply turning them away. Um, I would love to see human rights foreign policy. I would love to see human rights be the cornerstone of a presidential administration. It hasn't happened in my lifetime. If Harris wanted to pursue a true human rights foreign policy in the ways that I outlined, I would be the first to endorse that. The problem, I think, is though that great power rivalry prevents that from happening because, as you said, the focus is on stopping China, curtailing its economic power, curtailing its military power. uh, if that's the preeminent purpose of American foreign policy and not trying to help the Uyghur population in China, then you're ultimately going to get human rights just being instrumentalized, the rhetoric of human rights being used in ways that aren't going to further um, enhance or let's put it this way, I think it's not going to improve the condition of people who are suffering from human rights abuses in those countries.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's unfortunate, but that's where we are at the moment. I, I would like to see things change.
Yeah, so do I. Oh, so would I. Um, With regard to China, of course, we have a country that seems to be in all sorts of economic crisis right now. We've got, the long-standing banking crisis, the long-standing real estate crisis. These things have been spoken of for quite some time, and yet they haven't reached a climactic end yet. So we're suspecting that these deep-seated problems will be at some point close to collapse, possibly if Harris does win in November during her administration. How do you think Harris would manage a potential Chinese internal financial crisis, which would have international implications? I mean, what are we looking at a bailout of the Chinese economy? I mean, what do you think a Harris presidency would do under those circumstances?
I think that would be an opportunity for hopefully, hopefully an opportunity for greater cooperation and collaboration between the United States and China. And this has been my point. This is one of the points I raised in a book I have coming out with Van Jackson in January called The Rivalry, Peril, which is that there's an opportunity here to think beyond competition. If indeed there were to be a sort of a greater economic downfall or decline in China, because you're right, to all the statistics that you point to indicate that China is in a decline. That decline, of course, is relative to the years of extraordinary um, GDP growth during the Obama years and up and through up to the Trump years up to COVID. But I would say that you're right. If China collapses, there goes a lot, including the United States. There goes a huge portion of our GDP, a huge portion of our trade networks, and that's not good for the economy. It's not good for Americans who will obviously face the consequences in terms of higher unemployment rates, and potentially even sort of stagflation. You see higher rates of inflation, with cheaper goods not being able to come to the United States, and then you're seeing unemployment as a result. That's you're back in a 1978 kind of scenario, which is not
Mm,
good. And I think that would be potentially, if I were Harris, a smart opportunity to say, well, let's move out of this rhetoric of competition. It's obvious that the major problem here was supporting China in ways that it doesn't collapse, not because we like the Chinese regime, because we like Xi Jinping, and we like the things that he does, but because if it were to Xi Jinping government were to face some sort of economic crisis, it's going to affect us all. I don't know though. My suspicion is that she might do the opposite, that this is sort of an opportunity to wield triumphalism uh,
uh,
and say, well, this is what this is. This signals the supremacy of the American system, and this is why our export controls worked, and this is the product of competition is the downfall of the Chinese regime, and we should celebrate that, and maybe even hope for regime change,
mm,
which
mm.
okay, I do not like Xi Jinping either. I wish there was someone else in power in China who did not even in a form of Hu Jintao or someone like that, a
Yeah.
figure who was more progressive. That's a relative term, but progressive than Xi. But I don't think regime change in the middle of an economic crisis is a good thing. And it must have to come from within the American people. Sorry, the Chinese people, not the American people. I don't know. That's my suspicion is that she's going to double down on sort of the same rhetoric that Biden has used to champion competition. But we will see. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully the Chinese system stays stable,
Mm.
despite all the myriad crises you mentioned, and we won't have to worry about this in the future.
Just a philosophical question on this point. There has been this notion since 2008 that things in the world, in this world, are too big to fail. Our economies were too big to fail, so our governments poured money into these broken enterprises, public money, into these broken enterprises in order to keep the system that we've known and loved for so long upright. But is there not also the countervailing prospect that sometimes things need to fail in order for us to realize a sort of different vision of the future? And if we take it to the geopolitical line of thinking, and we're looking at China, for instance, some people might say that China is fundamentally a corrupt and broken state, and it's no longer meeting the expectations of the Chinese people. So shouldn't it just be left to its own devices? If they can't sort stuff out, let it all fall over. The CCP was awful anyway, and maybe something new and better will take its place.
But the Chinese system is not the Soviet system. I think that's often the analogy here is that we're in a new Cold War, and in a new Cold War with China, we just should let it rot from within, like the Soviet system did. It ossified. It failed to innovate. It failed to turn to technology. It kept building tanks and got further into debt. Western Europe basically bailing it out, and it just died because again of internal turbulence. That analogy is not the case with China in 2024, where China is much more integral to the economic system that we have built since the Cold War. It's much more important in terms of a military player on the world stage. It is not uh, dependent upon autarky like the Soviet system was. A collapse of China would, as I said, or as we discussed, would bring about huge rates of unemployment in the United States, and not just the United States, but Europe as well. I mean,
Oh, and
you know,
Australia.
and Australia as well. And we could go on and on.
Yeah.
I could start listing countries, but and it's no continent would be spared. Africa, Asia, North America, no continent would be spared. Yeah, and this is what bothers me so much about the rhetoric on decoupling. It's like, oh, we just decouple ourselves from China. Maybe on some technological elements we can decouple from China, but decoupling from China as a cornerstone of an economic policy, that's downright insane. Because again, it's going to lead to um, decline in economic growth, decline in employment, and the export controls, I think, and those other punitive measures that the Biden administration has enacted towards China. We have yet to see the full economic effects of those measures. And people, more importantly, people in the United States won't register them as being, oh, that's a product of a policy towards China. Same thing with the tariffs that are happening. The tariffs, the effect that those tariffs are having that the Trump administration put on China are having their effect. But people aren't saying, oh, it's because the Trump administration put tariffs on China and therefore it's affecting my job or it's affecting the supply chain. They're just mad because things cost more, and they're mad because they're not in the same economic position as they were before. They're not necessarily drawing the correlations. It's not because people are stupid. It's because the policy is murky and it takes time to materialize. And that's my concern, is that it's a bad economic move, but it's also a bad political move, because the Democrats, I confess here my political allegiances. I think the Democrats, should prevail in 2024. Hopefully, they'll prevail in 2024.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the Democrats, if they were to stay in power, if Kamala Harris was to stay in power in 2028, and she continues down this punitive path towards China, I think it's not in and of itself the end of her political prospects, but it would certainly contribute to them if she continues down this path of punishing China as a way to isolate it and then causing further economic decline in China that would then wreak havoc, I think, in the United States and other parts of the world.
Assuming that things keep on going as they are and China stays upright, we're still left with the problems of, or at least the Harris a presumptive Harris presidency will be left with the problems of an autocracy being completely integrated in the economic life of liberal democracies and all the wonders that come from that. How do you think Harris will be able to continue pushing an American agenda, a trade agenda with, a country that just hasn't shared any of the political developments that the United States have gone through? I mean, if Xi Jinping is the type of leader that China will end up with in the future, so Xi then passes on to another person who's relatively hard-lined and very patriotically inclined, shall we say, that is going to be a problem for the United States moving forward. It doesn't matter who ends up in the White House, whether it's Harris or Trump, really.
Sure, but I would say we were fine with an autocratic China Xi's,
Yeah,
rise to power in
yeah,
2015. We were fine with that. It served our interests. China was autocratic then. Was it engaging in the same types of surveillance systems and or methods of surveillance? Did it did it have the repressive nature that the Xi regime has towards its own people and towards minorities, again, like Uyghurs? No, but it was still repressive. There were still human rights abuses in China. There was still an autocratic regime. Um, there was still very limited freedom of speech and freedom of expression. There were controls on the internet, etc. Those things have gotten worse under Xi. If it gets worse post Xi, that's also going to be bad for the Chinese people, and I don't want to see that. But the existence of an autocratic great power and a liberal democratic great power, those two being economically interdependent upon each other, those aren't incompatible, I think, with sort of creating a stable world order. That doesn't necessarily mean you let bygones be bygones, as we sort of said, and let China do what it needs to do. But you don't need to go after China in the same punitive measures, the same punitive ways, taking into account the punitive measures that the Biden administration has pursued against China. You don't have to do that. There are other tools at your disposal. Diplomacy, effective diplomacy, and engagement on issues, I think, is key. And that's what was happening for many years during at least the first term of the Obama presidency. It was only after 2011, where with the pivot to Asia, we said, oh, China's a threat. And even then, with the pivot to Asia, if you read Secretary Clinton's article in Foreign Policy that announced that pivot, she essentially says we can actually have cooperation with China. We don't want to put China down. We don't want to beat it down. Now the purpose of American foreign policy is to beat it down, and that became the policy under Trump, and it's now the policy under Biden, and that to me is very disturbing. Um, you know, China is not going anywhere, I think, as a major economic power, provided again there was some exogenous force, some existential crisis, that were to be akin to like the 2008 Great Recession or something like that happening. China's not going anywhere. We need to work with it, particularly on issues like climate change and illegal drugs and what's happening with fentanyl crisis. And we need to also work with it in terms of, economic coordination. And I don't see how it being an autocratic power is going to um, that just because it's autocratic is going to be making the United States uneasy. It's China's behavior, I think, in other parts of Southeast Asia that make and the global South in terms of its Belt and Road Initiative that make it concerned. But the United States has abdicated China. It's abdicated its role in those places to China. The Belt and Road Initiative is now over 10 years old. That's almost 10 years old. That is a product of American failure. The policy is just again, I mean, I don't need to say more. I think we left that area of the world to China.
yeah.
And so we can't play catch up either. So we have to deal with the reality of the world as it is, to paraphrase Ben Rhodes. And the reality is China is an autocratic regime. It has made inroads in the global South. It will continue to do so. We should not encourage a Chinese collapse. We should um, work with it as it is, and we should also try to achieve common ground on the areas where we can,
Yeah.
and hope that China is in a position where it's not turning into a more oppressive society. But China doesn't have an influence over our country either, or shouldn't have an influence over our country either in terms of our democratic outcomes. But anyway, that's more of an aside than anything.
You're talking to an Australian here who has been very familiar with the narrative locally, where the Chinese have very much interfered in local politics and
Yes,
the way of the world and the way that we see the world. So, quite frankly, I'm not so sure whether I sort of buy that right toward the end that
I
that's giving
know.
me the shivers. But anyway, look, you are right. I think that we have to take a much more realistic measure of China in the world and where we sit with regard to it, and trying to become ideological purists, as tempting and as lovely as that sounds in an ideal setting. It just will.
Hmm.
What's there was something that I saw on YouTube, one of these philosophical videos recently about utopia versus dystopia. And there is just, every time people try to move toward the ideal setting, everything goes pear-shaped and we end up in a dystopia. So really the relationship between the two is, and we have to be careful for what we wish for as well with regard to the whole China conundrum. I mean, there's only so much we can do
Sure,
to push it and alter its
sure.
behavior without it falling over and causing us all sorts of grief. So yeah. Look,
Hmm.
another issue, another pressing issue, I would say, is Africa. Now, we know that Kamala Harris visited Africa during her vice presidency. Trump has publicly and famously stated his disdain for African countries during his administration. How do you think a Harris administration will tackle some of the continent's bloody and complex conflicts, such as that taking place in Sudan? But also, there has been this god-awful situation erupting in a country very dear to me, Ethiopia. We
Hmm.
might be on the verge of some major regional war over the Grand Renaissance Dam project.
Hmm.
Ethiopia is a far more fragile state than I think many people, including many of the locals, believe it to be. Where would the where would a Harris administration sit on this? Obviously, she's interested in Africa, interested in stability, and interested in making inroads for America in what is now considered relatively speaking, a Chinese playpen. So,
Another great question. I think you'd have to see a Harris administration that would be unlike the Biden administration in the sense that what Biden has done with Africa is that he's seen, and this is the entire continent, sub-Saharan
yeah,
Africa, it's not you distinguish from Ethiopia and Algeria and South Africa. It's the entire continent, in my opinion, in my view.
mm,
He's seen as an adjunct of great power competition. And the national security strategy document that came out of the Biden administration mentions Africa, but mostly in the context of sort of Chinese influence in the Belt and Road Initiative, some things on climate change. Um, and it would have to take, therefore, Harris administration would have to take, therefore, African interests seriously as their own interests. I think the problem with that is that you'd have to chip away at sort of great power competition as the framework for American foreign policy. And I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm concerned about Africa for many reasons as Ethiopia, but there are other countries like South Sudan,
yeah,
what's happening with Boko Haram, and there are other, issues as well. The sovereign debt problem in Africa is huge, and that's you're sitting on a powder keg, I think, as it relates to sovereign debt, particularly in the wake of COVID and the Ukraine crisis,
yeah.
where many countries are dependent upon um, you know, on Russia and on Ukraine. I think there's a situation where you would have to what would compel the Harris administration, I think, to move in a different direction in Africa than Biden. I think if there were to be uh, some sort of crisis that would um, create economic conditions that would lead to greater migration out of Africa. I don't know. I'm trying to imagine scenarios as we speak, which is never a good thing, is to sort of come up with scenarios on the fly and pontificate in those terms. But the problem of south to south migration, that is, migration coming from parts of Sudan, South Sudan up to Algeria, up to Northern Africa, places like that. And those migrants trying to, some if they can afford, make their way into Spain and Portugal, and France. That's a huge problem, and Europe's been dealing with that for quite some time. Would that then lead to sort of migration westward? Yeah, I don't know. But the crisis that would have to be, unfortunately, in my opinion, the crisis that would have to exist for the Harris administration to take Africa more seriously would be one that was so calamitous that it would affect great power relations in ways that we have not seen. I don't know when that would be, and it's unfortunate because if I were truly interested in reimagining foreign policy, I would place climate change as a focus of my foreign policy, and Africa would be therefore a cornerstone of my foreign policy in trying to support African nations and support the infrastructure of African nations, not because the Chinese, as the Chinese have done with the Belt and Road Initiative, just not just because they want to establish an unequal economic relationship with parts of Africa, but because it's in our vested global interest to make sure that these countries are in a position where they can mitigate climate change in ways that they have not been able to up until this point. But that would again necessitate a new perspective on Africa that I'm not sure Harris would be willing to adopt. That's depressing. I'm sorry, but but that's where I'm
Michael,
at.
this whole topic is depressing. We deal, the funny thing is that, I've noticed now there's a pattern every time we do these podcasts. I always come up with this, God, this is depressing, because
Right.
geopolitics is really about
It's
problems.
depressing.
Some
It's
of,
not a hopeful
some of,
time.
no, it's not. It really isn't. So anyway, look, having said that, we're always preparing for a better future. So in the spirit of preparing for
Yes.
a better future, let's look at
Yes.
another crisis, shall we?
Fair enough.
So that other crisis is on America's doorstep, and it is the country of Haiti in the Caribbean. Biden
Mhm.
supported the creation and deployment of a Kenyan-led international policing force to restore order in that beleaguered country. How do you imagine Harris will continue America's support in this horribly chaotic part of the Caribbean? The Haitian gang Grand Griff's recent bloody rampage through the town of Pont Sonde showed that gang violence is escalating.
Unfortunately, my answer to this question is very similar to the prior question, which is that there'd have to be a further crisis beyond what currently exists in Haiti. That is, the crisis would have to spill outward and reach
Yeah.
American shores in some capacity. There'd have to be a crisis in migration. There's already there. I mean, as we know, there are already crises, happening in many parts of the world that are spurring people to leave those countries and flee to the United States. But with Haiti being so close to America's borders, and the situation in Haiti being so calamitous at the moment, really not at any point. I would say, maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, John. You have a different opinion, but since 1994, it's not
Yeah.
since the Aristide administration. And the solution at that point was to send in the Americans, send in the American military to stabilize the regime. I do not think that's in the best interest of the United States to do that. Nothing good has come from American intervention in Haiti going back to the 1920s. But if that's what we have at our disposal, that is that's a policy tool, that using the American military as a tool of intervening and stabilizing regimes, which is done many times throughout our history and done repeatedly, since the end of the Cold War, then that might happen. Um, but I don't know. I think there has to be some wider crisis that would reach America's shores, particularly in migration, that would cause her to do something. But then my concern is that her reaction would be just to send in the military, and some aid packages, of course, and economic aid. But economic aid and sending in the military is not going to end gang violence in the long term. It's not going to create a thriving, stable, democratic state in Haiti. And you know, right now, the way that JD Vance and Trump are using Haitian migrants,
There's your
to
problem,
further
right?
their right. I mean,
Yeah.
that's also, I was just getting more and more depressing. But the way that JD Vance and Trump are using Haitian migrants, and the disgusting comments that were made uh, on the House floor a couple weeks ago about Haitian migrants. They were made over Twitter, but the congressman tweeted it out on the House floor. You know, that's a toxic, to say the least, political environment
Yeah.
for any type of relief to Haiti. I'm not saying Harris would not do anything, or would not um, engage in sort of a wider support for Haiti because of that toxic rhetoric. I don't think that's the case, but I think it's just a tragic situation that we have people in this country, Republicans specifically, taking advantage of um, a crisis, and what's happening in Haiti. They're not necessarily linking the two, but taking advantage of that crisis and saying this is further evidence that these people basically do not deserve help. And add to that, they're making up stories, creating lies about eating cats and dogs. Um, this is horrible, and it doesn't serve the interests of the American people, certainly not Haitian immigrants, and not our foreign policy as it relates to Haiti.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. From the US, we're speaking with Associate Director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy and lecturer in history at Yale University, Dr. Michael Brenes. Michael, given Harris's prosecutorial background and her focus on international rules and norms, how might this influence her approach to foreign policy, especially in the realms of cybersecurity and international law enforcement?
I think Harris is very big on creating rules of fairness and rules of equity, and now the rules that facilitate equity. Whatever um, context that we're describing, or we're talking about. I think cybersecurity would be another area. Right now, there are no norms. I think as it relates to cybersecurity, there's efforts to kind of think about regulation of AI and regulation of cybersecurity as related to AI. And I think she would have to do more than what's currently being done on that front.
Yeah.
I don't know though. This is a very delicate situation, and it's very difficult in the sense that the technology always outpaces the response from Congress and the response from Washington to it. And I think at this point, though, with cybersecurity being such a threat, Russia relying upon cybersecurity attacks to not just in the United States, but in many parts of Europe, cybersecurity being an issue as it relates to the Chinese and Chinese relying upon IP theft and using cybersecurity attacks as a means to engage in IP theft. That means this is not a national problem. It's not an American problem. This is an international problem. And so you need to have Harris, I think, if she were to be inclined, engage in international discussions about setting global norms about cybersecurity and regulating what can and cannot be done. I think international law is not all is not always upheld, as we see as it relates to Israel and Palestine, but those norms should be in place nonetheless. If nothing other than being a reference point, they should exist. I think that's what should happen. And the United States can't solve the cybersecurity crisis alone. We can have responses to it, but we should develop norms and standards on an international basis, and also norms and standards as it relates to escalating or responding to cybersecurity attacks. What would prompt a particular response if a particular type of cyber attack were to occur? I don't think we have a sense of what should be done and what can be done to respond in appropriate means. But anyway,
Well, is that a consequence of the fact that many of the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs have now formed their own clique, their own lobby groups to make sure that whatever the American government were to talk about in terms of regulation, it's watered down in a way that favors their version? Because really, when you look at the international structures surrounding cyber and AI, the Europeans seem streets, if not light years, ahead of the Americans because they're quite happy to say
yes.
no, and they're quite happy to put these firms in a box. Whereas the Americans and the American government, whether state or federal, they're just looking for loopholes for, the likes of Musk and Zuckerberg to just to walk through and do whatever they like. It's kind of like robber baron capitalism in a sense.
In a sense, yes, in that Silicon Valley, I think, has always favored fewer government regulations and involvement over their technologies, what they can and cannot do, even though, of course, they then relied upon government contracts to be in the position where they are. Silicon Valley came to existence because the Pentagon in the 1950s and 60s was sending federal dollars into Stanford University and other places to create technologies that the United States could then use for national security purposes. Those eventually became used for civilian purposes, which is how you have Silicon Valley being what Silicon Valley became in the 80s and 90s. That contradiction, though, is endemic to American history and how we think about the role of government in American history. But I also think it's just that there's not a sense of taking this problem seriously. Yes, there's Silicon Valley has created a cabal. There's a cabal of these defense startups that have
Mm,
emerged in recent years. I've written about those and these startups and these figures like Peter Thiel
mm,
and others. Musk also being one of them. He's not a startup. SpaceX is not a startup, but SpaceX
mm.
gets a large portion of money from the Pentagon. Over
Yep.
80% of the venture capital money. Of these venture capital startups get 80%. He gets 80% of these funds from the Pentagon. Um, but I think also it's just the lack of the United States to take seriously what regulation would mean. I think it also has to do with the makeup of Congress and Congress being made up of um, or controlled by Republicans who don't want to regulate anything, and some of them are concerned. Some of the GOP members are concerned about AI, but they haven't done anything to stop it because they just on their surface on its surface they just oppose regulation, which is a particularly, I think, American problem. The Europeans don't have that problem. They don't have this
Yep.
visceral anti-government ethos. They don't have to overcome that problem, and we do, unfortunately. And I think
Mm.
that's also shaping policy.
Is that made worse by the fact that Kamala Harris comes from California, the seat of all, American tech entrepreneurs? Does that make her particularly vulnerable to being influenced in their general direction?
I don't know. I don't think so. She's a she's a California liberal in many ways. That is she's um very conservative in terms of like how she thinks about the role of business to your point. But she's also, I think, seems to be, it's uncertain, but her record as a senator seems to be willing to use government to further the interests of the people when she feels that business has crossed a line. And I think that's been evident in her career. Her role as a prosecutor, again, as she would see it, is one that creating fairness and equity in a system that's very unfair, that is discriminated against people, particularly African Americans and people of color. She saw herself whether that materialized or not, but she saw herself as someone who is um, uh, creating uh, greater opportunity for people within the system to not serve harsh sentences and things like that. I think the same can be said with how she treats the role of business and government. Business should function, it can function, but once you cross the line where it's infringing upon and infringing upon the rights of and harming Americans, then something must be done. I don't think she would see that necessarily as it relates to Silicon Valley and the Defense Department at this point, because we many of the technologies that Silicon Valley has promised us have not materialized. And so we don't know ultimately
Right.
what will happen. There've been drones sent from startups to Ukraine. Those drones have largely malfunctioned, and then Ukraine's now buying Chinese drones as a result. Uh, if there were to be a greater stake for Silicon Valley in the defense budget, and you start to see these companies making more weapons and having greater influence, then maybe you'd see her taking a more sort of role. At the moment, though, the Pentagon is doing quite the opposite. They're encouraging more contracts to be allocated to these companies because the promise is unlimited at this point. But if the effects become disastrous, then perhaps then you would see her step in and try to regulate, or Congress also pressure Congress
Yep.
to step in and regulate them.
So we'll have to wait for the Terminator moment before anything happens on that score, yeah?
Exactly. But
Yep.
then it's too late. And then Terminator has failed.
Well, that's
So
it.
right,
I'm just waiting for Skynet to make its announcement.
right.
Okay, so look, I just want to quickly touch upon that thorny issue of immigration. You made mention
Mhm.
in our little discussion about Haiti that, Haiti doesn't become a problem until it becomes a problem, namely, it becomes a migration problem for the United States. Central and South America are exactly that problem for the United States right now and for much of the Biden administration. And, Kamala Harris apparently was the immigration czar during that period of time. How do you think she's going to handle the various relationships among the Central and South American capitals to help tamp down America's current immigration problem?
My my reaction initially is that she's unfortunately going to be a disaster on this issue. Um,
Oh, it
uh,
gets worse,
it
Michael.
gets worse. Because look, I think I'm not saying this because of Harris personally or anything. I'm looking at her record. The first thing
Mm,
that she did as immigration czar when she went to the border, which has now been turned into a meme, is saying, "I have one message to immigrants, and that's don't come, don't come."
yeah. Mm,
And if you look at the border bill that was, the bill that came out of Chris Murphy's desk, so senator from my state of Connecticut, it was a bill that was supposed to be kind of a compromise. But if you look at it very carefully, or not so carefully, it's mostly a bill that offers punitive approaches to immigration, that more for border security, more for um, creating restrictions on the amount of immigrants that can come, or refugees, asylum cases, things like that. And Harris adopted that bill. She's embraced that bill. She's touted that bill and saying the GOP didn't want this bill. We had a solution to the immigration crisis. She, unfortunately, and most of the Democrats have capitulated to the Trump wing of the Republican Party on this issue because they feel that they have no other option.
mm,
They feel that immigration has become such a liability for their party that if they can't prove to the American people that they're going to get tough on immigration, then Trump is going to take their votes,
Yep.
or that
Yep.
people are going to vote for Trump based upon that. I think that's a disastrous political calculation. No one's going to out Trump Trump.
Mm,
If you are going to vote for Trump because of immigration policies, you're not going to vote for Kamala because she's adopting similar ones. You're
mm,
going to vote for
mm.
Trump,
Yep.
and it's much better to, at least in my opinion, it's much better for the Democratic Party to be in a position where they are saying, this is crazy. Immigrants make up the fabric of our nation. To go back to rhetoric that we heard even in the 2020 presidential election when Biden was saying this, Biden was talking about an end to Title 42, and then, end to the harsh Trump policies, and he kept many of those policies in place. He kept Trump Title 42 in place for another 2 years. He has now essentially or tried to close the border. He's closing opportunities for asylum seekers to this country, and Harris is saying the same things. And the Democrats have made this calculation that people who they think, I don't know what it is. My darkest suspicion is that they think that rural Americans hate immigrants, and that they want to attract rural Americans, and they have to double down on anti-immigration policies, which is such a trope. It's such a I think a fiction, like a something that comes out of the dark recesses of like Democratic consultants' brains. But I think that's might be the case. I don't know. And so we're in a very disastrous moment for immigration, because it means that, to your question, the Democrats aren't going to be in a position where they're going to want to work with any Latin American country, or any country in Central America to come to sort of solution to the crisis, because they just want to double down on we're tough on the border, and there's no need to vote for anyone who comes after Trump. If Trump doesn't get elected, there's no need to vote for them, because we've got this issue and we'll take care of you as Americans who are concerned about immigration. That's disastrous, and people are still going to come. I mentioned El Salvador earlier. They are facing multiple crises. There's I could go in Guatemala. I mean, there are many countries in Central and South America that are suffering from bad economic policies. I mean, Venezuela, of course. There are others. We can go on and on. And what's going to be the solution? Greg Abbott shipping immigrants to New York City, and then the Democrats just sort of acquiescing to that. That's disastrous. And I don't think Harris has a solution for that. I don't think she wants to have a solution for it. I think she wants, and most of the Democrats unfortunately want immigration to go away as a problem, but it's obviously not going to go away. They're going to have to deal with it, and they can't just deal with it by closing the border and shutting out people who have legitimate claims to asylum.
Michael, recently we spoke with British demographer Dr. Paul Morland on immigration flows internationally, and he said something that I kind of thought was actually a bit cheeky, but still has a ring of truth to it. If you're worried about immigration, then have children. Because you know that the American
Hmm.
population is declining, just like all the other population groups around. The only thing that's keeping it going is immigration. So you're quite right. Immigration is the lifeblood of the United States. But for those nativists who are worried about the immigrants taking their not taking their dogs, eating their cats, and taking their jobs, then have more children. Don't carp on about the fact that you're being outcompeted. If you don't have your migrants, you won't have your lifestyle, because who's going to do all the dirty jobs that, well, dare I say, white people generally, but also other immigrant groups who made it good in the United States or Australia or elsewhere don't want to do? So you either have more children that you can pass those goods on to the next generation, or you let the immigrants take that on. So there's your foreign policy dilemma just there.
Well, some members of the GOP have been advocating for this,
Mm,
and it comes out of some Republican intellectual circles, like Ross Douthat, New York Times columnist, has been advocating for you know having more children, and the state sponsoring that effort. So having
mm,
more children, but paying for the
yeah.
state, paying for maternity leave, things that we don't have maternity leave in the United States.
Mm,
Paternity leave. So if you don't have maternity leave, we definitely don't have paternity leave.
mm,
And a broader social network, social welfare state and network that can support families who want to have more children. Um, that is also, I think, not going to deal with immigration, and also kicking all the immigrants out. I mean, this is JD Vance Trump line. It's like, just kick all the immigrants out, and then you'll have more housing stock. You'll have more
Doesn't work that
jobs.
way.
It
Yeah.
doesn't work that way.
Mm,
And you have to deal with the issue itself, and both parties aren't doing that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, final two questions. Do we know anything about how Harris is going to develop its relations with Australia? Being an Australian and having a predominantly Australian audience, I think that we'd all want to know a little bit more about that, especially when it comes to AUKUS and the sale of US nuclear submarines to Australia.
I think there's a looming question of, I'm not an expert on Australian affairs. You were the expert probably. But I would say the way that Harris would view Australia is that they would still view it as, part of the larger Indo-Pacific strategy,
Yeah.
and they would view it as a key partner in constraining Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific, as they still do. They would continue to, I think, rely upon sending military aid and equipment to Australia. Um, they would, I think, also see Australia though as, um, hopefully, like a democratic partner, right?
Mm.
In this larger strategy, I think that, and hopefully they do. Um, but I think that's also, my overall problem is that is that the United States looks at countries like Australia and says, "Oh, how can we use them to our greater benefit so that they can be, tools of a policy that constrains China." And so they don't want to engage with them on the same terms that Australia wants to engage with the United States. It's an
Mm.
unequal relationship. And as much as we cherish, as we claim to cherish our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, that that rhetoric only goes so far in terms of how it materializes as a policy that benefits both Australia and the United States. The United States would, of course, say, well, we're helping support Australia in various ways and making it in a better position where it can challenge China if it were to be a situation where they need to challenge China.
Mm.
But yeah, as I'm sure, maybe you're going to disagree with me and claim that I'm wrong, but I don't think that Australia is getting everything out of the United States. Um, the partnership it has with the United States that Australia wants, and that's just a product of great power competition, and why I think it's also bad for the future of American foreign policy in the world.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that we don't have the sophistication necessary to try to squeeze the fruit of the United States to get what we want. We just don't. And look, you know
Right.
what? My major concern is at the moment is that I see a steady increase in permanent US basing out here in Australia.
Yes.
So I think that over time, the folk in Canberra are just going to give up on the whole sovereign defense and sovereign foreign affairs, and we're just going to slipstream into US thinking constantly. I mean, there was a time when we weren't like that, but now it seems that whatever government we tend to have, whether it's Labour, which would be your Democrat, or Liberal National
Yep.
Coalition, which would be your GOP, we're kind of very weak on those issues, and we don't care. We're just happy to dig stuff up and farm stuff and ship it out, and that's all that really matters. I think that that's a
Mm,
shame for us and our sovereignty,
yeah.
but look, it is what it is.
Hmm.
Lastly, let me ask you this one question. I've saved the best to last. In your opinion, Michael,
Okay.
in your opinion, Michael, what should we learn from the woman who was part of the Biden team that led to America's sloppy withdrawal from Afghanistan, who covered up her boss's obvious physical and mental decline, and who was not noted for covering herself in glory when she was in charge of US immigration, as you rightly stated? Are these the hallmarks of her leadership style, or can she
Hmm.
successfully gain the American public's confidence in spite of these perceived black marks against her vice presidency?
I mean, one shouldn't be judged by their failures alone. If the failures are are overwhelming to the point that it drowns out your successes, then that's a problem. But
Yeah.
the things you point to, I think, they are indeed limits. Yeah, I would say the withdrawal from Afghanistan is something that I supported. I think it could have been carried out in a different way.
Yes.
And I don't necessarily know that that was Harris's fault, as opposed to a larger failure of the national security structure in the Biden administration. I would say the same with immigration, that, I think Harris is in a position where she feels she has to, or she did in 2021, yeah, have to uphold the Biden administration's policy. And Biden basically said, I don't want to deal with this problem. You deal with it, and
Mm.
deal with it in the ways that the Biden administration, Joe Biden personally perhaps wanted to deal with it, which is sweep it under the rug and then just try to out Trump.
Mm.
Um, I think there's, which is not to say that I think Harris is a tabula rasa, that there's a, blank slate there. She has a record. She has made these decisions. She has been part of a policy making apparatus. Um, and I think that's also, but I'm also hopeful in the sense that, I don't really know what she stands for. I think it's yet to be determined what she stands for. And I
Yeah.
mean that both in a domestic and foreign policy sense.
Mm.
Like, I don't really know what she's passionate about. There are people around her who are passionate about certain issues. Phil Gordon, passionate about European affairs,
Mm.
preventing a wider war in the Middle East. There are people around her who have concerns. But I've asked this to several of my friends and colleagues, and they all don't seem to know. I
Mm.
ask you with genuine interest.
Mm.
It's unclear to me what motivates her. Obama, it was healthcare, right? Healthcare and getting out of Iraq and
Yeah.
allocating more troops to Afghanistan. But she's kind of like a George W. Bush type of figure. Like, I don't really like Bush he represented sort of an amalgam of Republican ideas and concepts at the time of limited government and um, you know uh, privatizing elements of American government, and I think Harris can be that too. But then, sorry, I should back up and say Bush had a moment that was thrust upon him, and he defined
Mm.
his presidency around that moment, or the moment defined him.
Mm.
And I think the same can be said about a Harris presidency. She has an opportunity, I think, to come into power and say, how do I want to define myself? How do I want to be judged? And carry that out. Or she can be kind of like she is now and pursue different policies in the ways that are, again, are amalgam of democratic, interests and policies that have come before her, and then have potentially a moment thrust upon her, and then see how she responds.
Mm.
I wouldn't. I would rather prefer. I prefer the former as opposed to the latter. I'd prefer
Yeah.
her to take charge, and that's um, a sign of clear strategic leadership.
Mm.
At the moment, I don't know what would be the thing that defined her leadership qualities, other than I'm not Donald Trump. Trump is a threat to democracy. Please vote for me because you don't want the republic to end on in November, if not January of next year. Which, hey, she's got my vote purely on that basis, but that
Mm.
doesn't create an affirmative vision. It doesn't spill out an affirmative vision of any kind. And so we have to engage in these conversations on podcasts or in other places,
Mm.
speculating what she might do, because she is indeed, I think, an enigma.
Mm.
And we have to wait and see.
Michael. Anyway, politics, what are you going to do? Michael, you've got a book coming out early next year. Can you give us a little bit of
Yes.
a little hint about what that's all about?
So I have a book coming out with Yale University Press in January 28th of next year. It's called The Rivalry, Peril: How Great Power Competition Threatens Peace and Weakens Democracy. Maybe the subtitle gives it away. I co-wrote that book with Van Jackson, who's a political scientist in New Zealand, and a friend of mine. And we argue that the American focus, the US focus on great power competition with China as a framework for understanding international relations is flawed and will ultimately imperil democracy both at home and abroad, and creates or deprives, I think, the United States and its allies from envisioning a truly democratic world and a more peaceful world outside of a competitive framework. And I provided the history, the historical section of that book. You look at great power competition in eras past, and Van provided much of the future-looking aspects of the book. We're hoping people read it. It's available for pre-order now if you want to go get it.
Well, I will certainly go get it, and I'm hoping that I can get you and Van to come on the show to
Sure,
discuss your findings in more detail, which would be great.
sure. Love to,
Thank
anytime.
you. Fantastic. Michael Brenes, thank you for joining us again and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thanks, John. It was a pleasure.
That was American historian, author, and associate director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy and lecturer in history at Yale University, Dr. Michael Brenes. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Michael Brenes. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Michael and connect with him on social media. Now, questions to the audience. Do you believe Kamala Harris will forge a foreign policy path distinctly different from President Biden's? Do you think that Harris's background as a prosecutor and her focus on the rule of law will influence her approach to international relations? Harris has expressed nuanced views on Middle Eastern conflicts. Will her approach lead to a shift in US-Israel relations, or is this just wishful thinking? Considering her emphasis on alliances, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, what changes or continuities do you expect in America's strategy towards China? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have any comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my very best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.